A knock at the door in the dead of night. A sound so ordinary, so familiar, that no one would think twice before answering it. But on March 2nd, 2010, in the quiet suburb of Darien, Illinois, that knock would be the last thing Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael Kramer would ever hear. Within minutes, their lives were stolen in a calculated act of violence, one that seemed to have no clear motive, no obvious suspect. The brutality of the crime was chilling. A home invasion that didn't follow the usual patterns. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no apparent reason for the senseless executions that unfolded in the early morning hours. When law enforcement arrived, they were met with a horrific scene. A father, mother, and son, gunned down in their own home, their bodies left behind like discarded pieces of a sinister puzzle. But one thing stood out: the lone survivor. Angela Kramer, the daughter of Jeffrey and Lori, had somehow been spared. Hidden under a blanket, trembling as she made the 911 call that would set an entire investigation into motion. At first glance, it seemed like a home invasion gone terribly wrong. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a web of deception and manipulation so twisted that the real killer wasn't the one holding the gun. It was the one orchestrating it all from behind the scenes. The person who wanted the Kramer family dead wasn't a masked intruder or a random assailant. It was someone much closer. Someone who had spent years perfecting the art of control. What would drive a man to manipulate another into committing murder? How could a seemingly normal custody dispute unravel into a triple homicide? And why did one man, Jacob Nodars, become a puppet in someone else's deadly game? This is the story of the Kramer family murders, a case that would leave investigators questioning not just who pulled the trigger, but who was truly responsible for the bloodshed. And when the truth finally came to light, it would reveal a mastermind far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Welcome to That Police Officer. Here, we investigate the most troubling and complex murder cases. If you enjoy in-depth true crime analysis, make sure to like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing you the most compelling cases. The Kramer family had built a life that many would envy: stable, loving, and deeply connected. Jeffrey Kramer, a hard-working father, had always been a man of principle. He had spent years providing for his family, ensuring his children had the opportunities they deserved. His wife, Lori, was the heart of the household, a devoted mother who balanced warmth with discipline, instilling values of kindness and responsibility in her children. Their son, Michael, was young, full of promise, and still carving out his own path. Together, they formed a tight-knit family unit, one that should have been safe within the walls of their home. But beneath the surface, tensions had been brewing, an unseen force creeping into their lives, waiting to shatter their sense of security. That force came in the form of Johnny Borisov, a name that would later become synonymous with betrayal and bloodshed. Angela Kramer, the family's eldest daughter, had once believed Johnny was her future. The two had been in a relationship, and from it came their child, a boy who would forever link them together. But love had long since faded, replaced by resentment, conflict, and, eventually, fear. The custody battle between Angela and Johnny was relentless, a tug-of-war over their son that spiraled beyond the confines of the courtroom. Johnny Borisov was no ordinary ex-boyfriend. He was persuasive, manipulative, and always looking for control. Those who knew him saw the charming exterior, but those closest to him understood there was something far more dangerous beneath. His hold over people was subtle, yet absolute. It was the kind of control that made people do things they never imagined. The kind of control that could turn a dispute into a vendetta. Darien, Illinois, was the last place one would expect such darkness to take hold. A suburban enclave, defined by tree-lined streets and quiet neighborhoods. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed like a distant reality, something that happened elsewhere, to other people. The Kramers were part of that suburban ideal, a family who blended into the safe and predictable rhythm of everyday life. But on that fateful night, their illusion of safety was shattered. The walls of their home, which had once shielded them from the outside world, now bore witness to a crime so brutal that it would forever change the way people saw their quiet town. A crime that was not driven by greed or impulse, but by something far more sinister: the calculated destruction of an entire family. And as investigators would soon discover, the man responsible for it all had never even stepped inside the house. The early hours of March 2nd, 2010 were silent in Darien, Illinois. The town, known for its stillness at night, was undisturbed, except for one house. A house where horror was about to unfold. At approximately 3 a.m., a lone figure approached the Kramer home, moving carefully, deliberately. The air was cold, heavy with an eerie stillness. The residents inside were asleep, unaware that their final moments were closing in. The intruder knew the layout, knew where to go. This wasn't a reckless break-in, it was a mission. Entry was swift. A shattered window. The careful steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had prepared for what came next. There was no time wasted. The target was clear. The first victim never saw it coming. The gunman moved with precision, ensuring there would be no struggle. The shot was close-range, sudden. A muffled scream barely had time to escape before it was silenced. The second victim was next. A figure startled awake in the dark, disoriented, trying to make sense of the chaos before being met with the same brutal fate. But the killer wasn't finished. There was still one more. A presence in the house, unaware of what had just happened only feet away. But there would be no warning, no chance to run. The third gunshot rang out. Then another. The violence was absolute, methodical. And yet, someone had survived. Angela Kramer had woken to the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She wasn't supposed to be alive, but somehow she was. She made the only choice she could. She hid, pressed herself into the shadows, covered herself with a blanket, willed herself to disappear. Every second stretched on endlessly, her mind racing with the terrifying knowledge that the person responsible for this was still inside. She clutched her phone with shaking hands, dialed 911, forced herself to stay silent as she whispered for help. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, steady, a lifeline in the darkness. But would help arrive in time? When the first officers pulled up to the house, they had no idea what they were walking into. Dispatch had reported a possible shooting, but nothing prepared them for what they found inside. Blood, bodies, the overwhelming stillness of a home that had just been turned into a crime scene. Angela was discovered in shock, her voice barely able to form words. She had survived, but she had also witnessed something unimaginable. As investigators surveyed the home, questions flooded their minds. This wasn't a burglary. There was no sign of theft, no indication of a struggle. The only thing missing was something far more valuable than any possession: 3 lives, taken in cold blood. And the most haunting question of all, was the killer someone the Kramers had trusted? Someone who knew exactly how to strike without hesitation? The search for answers had only just begun, but the truth waiting to be uncovered would be far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The morning light did nothing to soften the horror inside the Kramer home. Crime scene investigators moved cautiously through the house, documenting every bullet casing, every bloodstain, every shattered remnant of a life interrupted. The sheer brutality of the murders was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was an execution. But the biggest question still lingered. Who would want the Kramers dead? Law enforcement worked quickly, knowing that in cases like this, the first 48 hours were critical. They began piecing together the family's last known interactions, searching for anything that could explain why someone had targeted them with such precision. The absence of forced entry raised an immediate red flag. If the killer hadn't needed to break in, could that mean the Kramers had known their murderer? Could they have trusted the very person who betrayed them? The neighborhood was canvassed. Investigators knocked on doors, looking for witnesses, but at that hour, most of Darien had been fast asleep. No one had seen the shooter approach. No one had seen them leave. Security cameras from nearby homes provided little insight. The figure that had entered the Kramer home had moved like a ghost, slipping in and out undetected. Still, detectives refused to believe that a crime of this magnitude could be random. There had to be a reason. They began exploring the usual motives: money, revenge, personal disputes. But the Kramers weren't known to have enemies. There were no outstanding debts, no risky business dealings, nothing that suggested they had been involved in anything dangerous. If this had been a professional hit, it lacked the usual hallmarks. There was no attempt to disguise the scene, no efforts to mislead investigators. It was messy, emotional. It felt personal. Then, something surfaced, something that changed the course of the investigation. Angela Kramer, the lone survivor, had been locked in a bitter custody battle. Her ex-boyfriend, Johnny Borisov, was fighting for their child. And according to those who knew the situation, the conflict had escalated far beyond the courtroom. Detectives looked into Borisov immediately. His name was already familiar to some of them. He had a history of conflict, of manipulation, of bending situations to his advantage. People described him as controlling, someone who didn't take no for an answer. He had been involved in heated disputes with Angela's family, arguments that had become more intense in the months leading up to the murders. The possibility was undeniable. Was this an act of revenge? A way to punish Angela by taking away the people closest to her? But there was a problem. Johnny Borisov had an airtight alibi. He hadn't been anywhere near the Kramer home that night. In fact, he had been at a casino, a place crowded with people and security cameras. There was no way he could have pulled the trigger. The revelation was frustrating. Investigators were convinced that Borisov was connected, but without evidence, their hands were tied. They needed another angle, another lead. In the meantime, they pursued other possibilities. Could it have been an unrelated break-in? Had someone targeted the wrong house? A few tips came in. Claims of a suspicious vehicle, rumors of someone seen lurking near the neighborhood days before. But none of them led anywhere solid. Every potential suspect was ruled out. Every promising lead collapsed. Days passed, then weeks. The pressure was mounting. 3 people were dead, and the person responsible was still out there. The case wasn't cold yet, but it was slipping away. And then, just as hope was beginning to fade, a new piece of information changed everything. A name surfaced. Someone on the fringes of the investigation. A person who had seemed insignificant at first. But as investigators dug deeper, they found something chilling. This person had a direct connection to Johnny Borisov. And most importantly, they had no alibi for the night of the murders. The case was about to take a turn no one saw coming. The shocking twist. The real suspect comes into view. The case had stalled, hovering on the brink of uncertainty. Investigators knew Johnny Borisov was somehow involved, but without evidence, suspicion wasn't enough. They needed something solid, something that could break the case wide open. And then, they got exactly that. At first glance, Nodars didn't fit the profile of a killer. He wasn't a career criminal, nor did he have any known connections to the Kramer family. In fact, before his name was mentioned, he had barely been on investigators' radar. But the more they dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Nodars had a troubled past. He had battled drug addiction, struggled with mental health issues, and seemed to be drifting through life without direction. But what stood out the most wasn't his personal history. It was his connection to Johnny Borisov. Nodars had been one of Borisov's few close associates, someone who had fallen under his influence in a way that few truly understood. When detectives tracked him down, Nodars wasn't in Darien. He had fled the state, retreating to Florida as if trying to escape the weight of what he had done. It didn't take long for authorities to close in. And when they did, the moment of reckoning came swiftly. Jacob Nodars cracked. In the interrogation room, his story poured out in fragments, half-coherent admissions, glimpses of a mind unraveling under the pressure of his own guilt. He confessed to being the one who pulled the trigger. He admitted to creeping into the Kramer home in the early morning hours and executing the family in cold blood. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Nodars claimed he hadn't done it alone. He hadn't chosen his victims. He hadn't even wanted to kill. He had been told to. And the man who had orchestrated it all? Johnny Borisov. It was a twist investigators had suspected but could never prove. until now. Nodars's confession provided the missing piece, exposing the horrifying truth behind the murders. Borisov had never needed to pull the trigger himself. Instead, he had manipulated someone else into doing it for him. Borisov had preyed on Nodars's vulnerabilities, exploiting his fragile mental state with ruthless precision. He had convinced him that he had no choice, that he was being watched, that if he didn't carry out the killings, something terrible would happen to him and his family. It was psychological warfare, calculated, relentless, and devastatingly effective. Nodars had been pushed to the brink, driven by fear, until he saw no other option. And on the night of March 2nd, he had done exactly what Borisov had instructed, silencing 3 lies while the true mastermind sat miles away, his hands clean. But now, the truth was out. And with Nodars's confession, the investigation had transformed. The pieces had fallen into place. Johnny Borisov wasn't just a bitter ex-boyfriend. He was a puppeteer, pulling the strings from the shadows. A manipulator who had turned a custody battle into a death sentence. A man who believed he could get away with murder without ever touching a gun. But law enforcement had other plans. The hunt for justice had taken a dramatic turn. And for Johnny Borisov, the walls were finally closing in. With Jacob Nodars's confession, investigators had uncovered the executioner. But the real danger had always been the man behind him. Johnny Borisov wasn't just an ex-boyfriend with a grudge. He was something far more insidious. Cold, calculated. A master manipulator who had orchestrated a massacre without ever stepping foot inside the Kramer home. To understand the depths of Borisov's depravity, detectives had to look back to where his obsession with control had begun. Johnny Borisov had always been the kind of man who needed to win. Those who knew him described him as charming on the surface, but deeply manipulative underneath. He had a way of twisting situations to his advantage, making people question their own thoughts, their own reality. If he wanted something, he would stop at nothing to get it. And when it came to Angela Kramer and their child, losing was never an option. The custody battle had been a bitter one. From the beginning, Borisov saw it as a personal attack, not just from Angela, but from her entire family. He believed they were conspiring against him, poisoning his son against him, working together to strip him of his parental rights. And the more the Kramers fought to keep him away, the deeper his hatred grew. But for Borisov, anger wasn't expressed in outbursts. He didn't make threats or lash out in the open. His revenge was slow, methodical, like a game of chess, where every move was designed to bring him closer to his ultimate goal. By the time the shots were fired, he had made sure of one thing: his hands would never touch a weapon. He would be miles away, surrounded by witnesses, with an ironclad alibi. To anyone looking from the outside, he was just a man in the middle of a custody dispute, a father who wanted to be in his son's life. But the truth was something much darker. Borisov didn't just want revenge. He wanted complete and utter destruction. With the Kramer family gone, Angela would be alone, isolated, broken, vulnerable. And in his mind, that meant he had won. But what Borisov hadn't counted on was the resilience of the justice system. The moment Nodars confessed, his perfect plan began to crumble. The psychological walls he had built around his own guilt could no longer hold. The truth was out, and now, it was only a matter of time before justice caught up with him. With Johnny Borisov in custody, the case against him was far from over. His arrest was just the beginning. What followed was one of the most chilling trials in recent memory. One that would expose the depths of manipulation, fear, and cold-blooded calculation that led to the brutal murder of the Kramer family. The prosecution's key witness was the man who had once been Borisov's pawn, Jacob Nodars. By the time he took the stand, Nodars was no longer the same person who had pulled the trigger that night. He had spent years behind bars, tormented by what he had done. When he spoke, there was no bravado, no excuses, just the painful truth of how he had been drawn into a nightmare he couldn't escape. He recounted, in excruciating detail, how Borisov had manipulated him, how he had convinced him that he was being watched, that his life was in danger, that the only way to protect himself was to eliminate the Kramers. The jury listened as Nodars described the way Borisov had twisted reality, how he had driven him deeper into paranoia, feeding his fears until he could no longer distinguish them from truth. And then came the most haunting part, his account of the crime itself. Nodars's voice trembled as he described creeping into the Kramer home, the deafening gunshots that shattered the silence, the final moments of 3 innocent lives. He spoke of Angela Kramer, the only survivor, how she had hidden, how she had heard it all. And he admitted what had become undeniably clear: this wasn't his crime. It was Borisov's. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that backed Nodars's confession. Phone records, witness testimonies, and months of threats from Borisov painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated the murders from a distance, confident he would never be caught. The defense, in contrast, attempted to discredit Nodars, portraying him as a liar, a man who had acted alone and was now shifting blame to escape the harshest punishment. But there was no escaping the facts. The jury saw through the deception. They saw through the cold, remorseless expression Borisov wore in court, his unwillingness to acknowledge what he had done. When the verdict was read, it was swift and final, guilty on all counts. Johnny Borisov was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He would never be free again. For the Kramer family, it was justice, but justice could never undo the loss. Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael were gone. No verdict could bring them back. Angela Kramer, the sole survivor, faced the unimaginable task of moving forward. She had lost everything in one night: her parents, her brother, the life she had known. The trauma of that morning would never fully leave her. She refused to let Borisov's evil define her future. She focused on raising her son, on building a life where she could find moments of peace despite the pain. She became a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the wake of unimaginable horror, strength could endure. The case of the Kramer family murders became a chilling reminder of how manipulation can turn deadly, of how a single person's thirst for control can destroy lives. It was a story of evil, but also of justice. And for Angela, it was a story of survival. The murders of Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael Kramer were not the result of a random act of violence. They were the calculated outcome of a man's ability to manipulate and control. Johnny Borisov never pulled the trigger, yet his influence was lethal. He turned words into weapons, using fear, paranoia, and psychological torment to push another man to kill for him. Cases like this serve as a stark warning about the power of psychological manipulation. Most people assume that threats come in obvious forms: raised voices, direct violence, clear danger. But Borisov's tactics were far more insidious. He didn't force Jacob Nodars to commit murder at gunpoint. He didn't have to. Instead, he rewrote his reality, feeding him lies, preying on his vulnerabilities, breaking him down until he no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. This is the terrifying reality of coercion. Not every act of violence begins with a gun in someone's hand. Sometimes, it begins with a whisper in their ear. Justice was served, but at an unimaginable cost. 3 lives were taken in a matter of minutes, but the ripples of that night will last forever. A daughter lost her family. A community lost its sense of safety. Even the man who carried out the crime, Jacob Nodars, became another casualty of Borisov's manipulation, spending his days in a prison cell, haunted by what he had done. And for Angela Kramer, the pain can never truly fade. No amount of courtroom victories, no sentence, no punishment will ever erase the horror of that night. She survived, but survival does not mean forgetting. It means carrying the weight of loss every single day, finding a way to keep moving forward even when the past threatens to pull her back. The tragedy of the Kramer family serves as a lasting reminder of how far evil can reach when left unchecked. It is a case that forces us to question the nature of influence, the fragility of the mind, and the devastating consequences when the wrong person gains control. But it is also a story of resilience. Because despite Borisov's attempts to destroy, Angela Kramer endured. And in the end, the justice system prevailed. Evil may have orchestrated that night, but justice, though delayed, was not denied. The case of the Kramer family murders is one that leaves lingering questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? And how do we protect vulnerable individuals from falling under the influence of those who seek to manipulate and control? Psychological manipulation is a silent but powerful weapon. It doesn't always leave visible scars, but its effects can be just as devastating. It can turn friends into enemies, push the weak to commit the unthinkable, and destroy lives without a single shot being fired. Understanding the warning signs, coercion, emotional abuse, and psychological control can be the key to stopping tragedies before they unfold. This case is a heartbreaking reminder that true crime isn't just about criminals and investigations. It's about real people. Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael Kramer were more than victims of a headline-grabbing case. They were a family. They had lives, dreams, and futures that were stolen in an instant. Their story should never be reduced to just another crime statistic. Now, we turn the question to you. What do you think? Could anything have been done to stop this? How do we hold manipulators accountable before their influence turns deadly? Share your thoughts below. And most importantly, remember the Kramer family. Their story deserves to be told, not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson we cannot afford to ignore.